Hello, I'm Andrea Abrams. I am the Associate Vice President for Diversity Affairs at Center College. I'm also a professor of anthropology. And as an anthropologist, I do a lot studying identity, particularly around race, gender, and culture. And the three books I'd like to talk about today deal with that. The first one is called Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. Now, I've got to give a caveat here. The first two I'm going to talk about are actually fantasy novels. I don't usually read fantasy novels because they're about creating these alternate cultures, and I quite frankly find them implausible at times. But these two actually pass the sniff test. So the first one is Trail of Lightning. It's the first in a trilogy called the Six World Trilogy series. Rebecca herself has won the 2019 Locust Award for Best First Novel and the 2019 Hugo Award finalist for Best Novel. She's of African American and Native American ancestry. So this book takes place in the near future. Environmental degradation has resulted in the flooding of the United States. And Native American supernatural beings have raised a wall around Native Americans, protecting them from the floodwaters. So they're the only ones in dry land. But supernatural beings include both benevolent beings, and monsters. And the monsters are wreaking some havoc. The main character, Maggie Hosky, is a monster slayer. And she goes around protecting people, and she has her sidekick, a medicine man, which is a spiritual expert within Native America. So this book does have some obvious Buffy the Vampire Slayer aspects to it. It employs a lot of Native American mythologies. It's actually received some criticism for conflating different cultural mythologies and taking some liberties with that. I find it kind of interesting because of this metaphor of a wall that's keeping indigenous people safe from the rest of the United States has some really interesting political implications. This is not a novel of great intellectual depth, but it's a fun, gripping read with characters that will warm a feminist heart. The second book pretty much does the same thing. This one is called The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin is an African-American science fiction and fantasy writer. She's actually won a Hugo Award for all three of the books in this trilogy, and she's the first African-American to win the Hugo Award for Best Novel. The Fifth Season is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy. So this takes place in a place called the Stillness, which may or may not be the Earth, I'm not sure. The Stillness is an ironic name because what's actually happening is that there's these earthquakes that happen all the time that just destroy the world, and then they have to build everything up over again. And they go through this kind of like a seasonal basis, and they're always on guard for this. This book deals with a lot of my favorite topics: culture, resistance to oppression, gender, and race. So there are a lot of, one of the big things going on in this book are there's all these distinct communities, right? And they are kept separate from each other, and they're considered different castes, different races. So there are origins, people with the ability to control energy, particularly the ground and the weather. Guardians are people who use pain and social conditioning to oppress and control the origins. Geomest, who are people, are academics who study what's going on with the environment. Comless are people that don't have a community. They're just kind of wandering about and don't have a fixed identity, and so they're a problem. Strongbacks are a labor caste. There's the leadership caste. There's a lot of castes. So there's a lot going on in terms of hierarchy. A lot of science and magic are mixed into this. In this fantasy world, because there are all of these different castes and races that are kept distinct from each other, what becomes into what I kind of see going on underneath, I think the author is doing, is really questioning how different these different groups are actually from each other. How much is of their difference has been shaped by the privilege and oppression they've received, how much of it is because of how they've been deliberately either limited or in terms of their abilities are pressed to enhance their abilities in certain ways. And the fact that the key to saving this world is the interconnectedness and the interdependence of their different talents and skills, right? The main characters in these books are two fierce women, a mother and a daughter, and then a sexually fluid male character. There are also some sentient rocks. It's wild, y'all. So book is interesting because there's a disruption of gender stereotypes and racial stereotypes, and it's a story of resistance to oppression. One of the other interesting things about this book is that it tells the story from different perspectives of the same character. So it plays with the notion that our own positionality, our own sense of self shifts, and that there is no one way to see or be in the world, even as an individual. Good book, right here. Great book. Series, wonderful. All right. But that idea of there not being one way to be in the world leads me to my third recommendation, Gods of the Upper Air. So this is nonfiction, all right? This is Gods of the Upper Air, How a Circle of Renegade Anthropologists Reinvented Race, Sex, and Gender in the 20th Century by Charles King. This title is taken from a quote by Zora Neale Hurston, which I'm going to read. She writes, I do not say that my conclusions about anything are true for the universe, but I have lived in many ways, sweet and bitter, and they feel right for me. I have walked in storms with a crown of clouds about my head and the zigzag lightning playing through my fingers. The gods of the upper air have uncovered their faces to my eyes. She wrote this in 1942. What this quote is getting at, it continues a little bit further where she talks about, compares the gods of the upper air view to the pigeonhole view. So the pigeonhole view is seeing things only from your limited perspective from the ground and how you see the world. And in contrast to the gods of the upper air, who can see everything and the complexity of the ways of being. And anthropology is a discipline that really goes back and forth between the pigeonhole view and the gods of the upper air view. Again, getting at this idea of how important it is to understand that you need to see the world from different perspectives. This book is really interesting because it tells it's a biography of a very important part of anthropology. So some of the hallmarks of anthropological thought are that identities, such particularly gender, race, ethnicity, are largely learned rather than biological and innate, that we should understand a different culture from the perspective of the people who are actually in that culture, cultural relativism, and that humans are probably more alike than they are in fact different. As wonderfully varied as we are in fact one race, the human race. In large part, we can owe this perspective to a Jewish immigrant, Franz Boas, and the four women he mentored at Columbia University, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, and Ella Cara Deloria. And this is the biography of how they did this, of both their personal lives and the anthropology that they created. The women, Franz Boas is wonderful. The women in this book are absolutely fascinating. Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, but both gender and sexual norms. But I'll be honest, my heart belongs to Zora Neale Hurston and Ella Cara Deloria, right? So Zora Neale Hurston was one of the first African-American anthropologists. Zora Neale Hurston was one of the first Native American anthropologists. You might see a theme right now in these three books that's connecting them. They were doing anthropology at a time when anthropology was basically really trying to render African Americans and Native Americans as inherently other and lesser than. And they were writing against this. They were resisting this. They were studying their own cultures and the beauty and magnificence and the diversity within their cultures. What also makes them interesting, and I think ties all of these books together, is that both Zora Neale Hurston and Ella Cara Deloria, in addition to being anthropologists, were writers. They both wrote novels. And at different points in their time, in different times in their lives, because of racism, sexism, and classism, they had to choose between being an anthropologist and being a writer. And what both of them did brilliantly was to actually fuse these things and to bring their art and their science together in the novels that they wrote. Taken together, The Gods of the Upper Air, The Fifth Season, and The Trail of Lightning um, celebrate the ingenuity and power of women of color, both real and fictional, and their ability to reimagine and profoundly reshape their worlds for the better. And I think if you read all three of them, you will be better for it.